So next one we got NATO. NATO says a record of more than 20 allies are expected to hit alliance's target for defense spending this year. Sorry about it. I got a hiccup. Okay, who actually reports it from the right? Fox News, perhaps. I do not read many right-wing articles nowadays. I mean, that's because they just tend to show up my email address and I don't like that. Okay, let's read The Hill. I'm actually tired. I'm not sure if I'm gonna be able to finish it or how many we still have up. Including this, we have 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13 articles. We'll get through somehow. 23 NATO members on track to meet 2% GDP spending goal. How many members are in NATO? I think it's like 29 or yeah, I think 29. No, 32 actually. They read it right here. President Biden on Monday welcomed as good news the announcement that 23 countries in the 32-member NATO alliance are on track to spend 2% of their GDP on military defense this year, an important benchmark established in 2014. No or yes? Yes, no. I know Trump made it a big vocal point in his campaign, therefore one would assume it was his idea. I know he was pushing for it the most, definitely. In his presidency, that team NATO members should spend 2%, although I'm not quite sure if this was actually established in 2040, or maybe they're talking about the benchmark they just follows the GDP they put into the defense. I'm not quite sure. But I mean, Trump was one of the loudest for other NATO members to spend much more on their defense. We have a very important announcement to make today. A record number of allies are meeting NATO's commitment to at least 2% of their GDP on defense. This isn't anything you should be celebrating, this should be given. Biden said in remarks at the White House ahead of a meeting with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Every nation should have a capable military to defend itself. Like that should be. Like you should not be celebrating that the nations in your alliance are actually now finally investing money in their defense forces. Stoltenberg said 23 members of the alliance will spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense in 2024. NATO allies agreed in the 2014 summit held in Wales that member states would increase their respective domestic defense spending to 2% of their GDP. Just 5 years ago, there were still less than 10 allies that spent 2% of GDP on defense, he said in remarks delivered on Monday at the Wilson Center. This is good for Europe and good for America, especially since much of this extra money is spent here in the US, Stoltenberg continued. Part of a pitch to show up American support for NATO that is under attack from former President Trump. Well, I mean, he never said anything against NATO, if I remember, or anything explicit. Although he said a lot of very bold statements. I mean, which I do still think are mainly because of the campaign. For campaign, like both of these candidates will say a lot of shit they will never uphold. He said he would not defend members that do not spend 2% of their GDP. Otherwise, this is a bit unhinged from Stoltenberg. Trump has repeatedly criticized NATO allies for not spending more on the defense. The presumptive Republican presidential nominee has been a vocal critic of the NATO alliance and has threatened to withdraw the US from the alliance or hold back American commitments to the defense of all members who have yet to increase their defense spending to meet the 2% mark. Biden said Monday that the number of countries in the alliance meeting the 2% spending mark more than doubled since January 2021. I wonder what could happen in that timeline that could actually force them to finally spend more money on the defense. Definitely couldn't be any war, any threat to their own sovereignty. Again, as I said before, this is nothing you should celebrate. Like this should be given. They spend 2% on their GDP, 2% of their GDP minimum on defense. the ideal would be like 2.5% or 2.75% if you need to modernize your army. The statistics marks a key argument for Biden's re-election campaign, surrounding his leadership in NATO and his support for the defensive military alliance. Trump supporters say this is antagonistic rhetoric that has his antagonistic rhetoric has spurred allies to increase their defense spending. Not untrue, okay? It's not untrue. However, it definitely didn't have as big of an impact as the invasion of Ukraine has had. But the former president's critics say his threats against the alliance undermine trust in the US commitments. No, CIA, FBI, or CIA would not let them to withdraw from the alliance. Biden will hold NATO's 75th anniversary summit in Washington in July. The summit is meant to serve as a celebration of the alliance's history, but will also serve as a pivotal meeting to demonstrate support and resolve for Ukraine in its war against Russia and ahead of an uncertain American election. Allies worry that a potential Trump election will see the US pull back on its participation in NATO, threaten its unity, or push Ukraine into a ceasefire with Russia and on terms more preferable to Moscow. At the summit, NATO allies are expected to announce a number of initiatives that institutionalize the alliance's support for Ukraine and that serve to take over the leadership role currently held by the US. And who is going to take over? None of the NATO members spend as much as the US. Nobody has a capable military, actually. Who would actually lead NATO or anyone other besides the US? NATO is the US and some other nations with poor militaries. That's a fact. Okay, I just lost my... Okay, this includes NATO taking the lead on organizing weapons procurement and deliveries for Ukraine, which is currently led by the US and a long-term financial pledge. And this is it. Trump was definitely vocal back in the day about the spending of NATO. He was pressuring other countries to spend more on the defense. This is something you have to give him. That he was pressuring, long before the Russians actually went into Ukraine. So you could theoretically say he actually saw this coming. He didn't. But yeah, the war in Ukraine finally kicked them in the ass to actually up their spending. But yeah, them definitely has a role to play here, and we should give him the praise for it, obviously. As I said, 2% is the minimal. 2.5% should be the ideal of GDP spent on military, on the defense. So there you go. Give credit where credit is due. Criticize where it's criticized where it's needed. He has a lot of flaws we need to criticize. And just between us guys, I would definitely not vote him. But then again, I would not vote Biden either. I will not vote any dinosaurs anymore. Well, I never actually did vote for a dinosaur though. I voted once. Well, I did vote for a dinosaur in a presidential election actually. I'm not an American, right? I'm not talking about the US right now. So, yeah. I usually voted for parties with whom had younger politicians there. It didn't pay off, and in the last election, I just put all the parties on a spinning wheel and I spinned it. First came the communists, so I spinned again, and then came the party I gave my vote to. That shows just how much I was disgusted by the current politics and just how little there were actually politicians that managed to connect with me. Moving on.